Kia ora. As promised, I will do a quick video about using the X32 edit software. For those of you who weren't in class, when we talked through it, it is the offline editor for the Behringer X32. But it also makes files that are compatible with the M32, so the Midas version of the desk. In class, I activated a gate and I'll turn off, and I renamed a track kick. I'll probably leave that in. I thought what would be useful is to look at a tech writer. This is something you might have for your band. It's got the stage plot of where the drummer is, things like DIs, the fact that we need power behind the drum kit for the sampler that we use, indications of the bass amp and the guitar amp, which side we like them on, although to be honest that doesn't matter a lot of the time. Whereabouts on the stage I want the vocals, and of course monitors, power at the front, bass guitar, and an input list. So if I was an engineer and this band was coming through to my town, I would want the desk to be laid out like this. So to save myself a bit of time, I'd just go through, and with the X32 edit I can go through and say, okay, I've got this kick. Remember, it's a right click to change the name, so I'm going to call this one, just going to go right click snare. And also remember, it's easier to name it first and then to change the color. So I'm actually going to get the kick, and I'm going to color code these things, so my drums are going to be red. So I've got hat left. The drummer in this band has a hi-hat on each side of the kit. So this one here, right click. I'm going to go hat left because it's engineer's perspective. Hat right. That makes a lot more sense. Then we've got toms 1 to 4. Cool, so here I'll have my bass DI. I think I'll do the bass in green. Guitar's going to be blue. Vocal. So that's my naming done. And we can see that's everything that's on the list. Now, one of the things you notice though is that, remember, on our X32 we've got channels of 16, or banks of 16 channels plus the DCAs, and then the bus masters depending on what layer we're on. So here I'm going to go through and say, these are my first 16 tracks, which is most of the band, mostly drums plus some bits and pieces. So I might have on my DCA kick, snare, and I'm going to make that red because it's part of the drum kit, and then I'm going to say just drums, and that will be red as well. So my first two DCAs, I've got one for the kick and snare and one for the rest of the drums. Now why do I want that? Sometimes I just want to boost up the kick and snare to really solidify the beat, and other times it's the whole drum kit I want louder, and so that gives me the choice of those two in this situation. Now if you've got good eyes, you can go through and say, okay, I want the kick on one and the snare on one, and then the hat on two, and the toms all on two. Now if I wanted to, I could do a separate toms DCA if I felt like it was the sort of thing that I needed to adjust, but in this case it's pretty much just drums. So there we go, all the drums are on DCA 1 and 2. Then I can have the bass on 3. In fact, I might just use solid colors for these so that they are differentiated. Because I've got a bass DI and a bass mic, I might blend them on these two and then use this for the overall level. Similarly for the guitars, I might decide I'm going to have a blend of the two mics, and they might be at different levels for some reason, and then I've got my overall level to take care of it. If I go down to 1732, now I've got my Vokes. Not unusual to have a Vokes track, and it's useful if you've got a quiet singer to share the gain staging a little bit. My Vokes, and I put the sampler, actually that should be light blue, and I usually put one called effects. What color haven't I used? Yellow. So there we go, that's going to be my effects. And I better actually make sure these things are true. So let's go back to layers 1 to 16. I've got my bass on 3, Got my guitar on 4. There's of course another way you can do this. You can go up to the config, I think, or is it, no, channel. In the channel strip you can see there's a bigger set of buttons. So as I go through selecting each channel, by selecting the name, you can see the different DCA groups come up here. There's DCAs. I could also do the same thing with mute groups, and sometimes people do that. I usually like to use mute 6 for everything. And that actually exists down here. There's 6 little buttons down the bottom here. So I use the last one on each. So I'll throw that on every track, and that means if I hit mute 6, it's going to mute. You can have multiple mute groups. So you could have a separate, you could say mute 1 is just your vocals. So maybe you want to mute the vocal mics for some reason. That can be mute 1. And mute 6 will turn off everything. Sometimes when I've got things I haven't used, I'll go through and make them black on black. Put my Vox on 5, DCA 5, put my sampler on DCA 6, and then I can go down to my effects returns, and these are all linked, and I can make sure that they're on 7. So you see I only have to click 1 and both come up because they're linked. That's this link here, which is actually done in the stereo link. So you choose a channel, hit stereo link under config, and it will ask you if you want to link to the channel next to it. Cool, so there's my effects returns all through a DCA, and that just means if the singer wants to talk, I can turn the echo or the delays off so that they are more understood. Good, okay, so if I wanted to go through and do any more, say for example, I wanted to go through and pick the channels that I want to have a compressor ready to go on. I mean, I'd normally have a compressor on the kick, and I would definitely have one on the snare. So if I change channels here, yes you can. So that's the cursor arrows. So you can't do it with the mouse, but with the cursor arrows I can say, right, there's my kick, got my low cut on at 35 Hertz, so that's pretty good. I could turn on my EQ and my gate, but just make sure your thresholds are set. The gate down low and the compressor up high, so it's not affecting the signal until you want it to. So I can go through, and if I wanted to, I could go and start sending bus sends, so they're ready. Although I would tend to do those live when you're controlling things. If you know you've got phantom power on certain mics, you might want to put the phantom power on already. Depending on what microphones we're using, we'd probably use a dynamic on the kick, but we may use a PZM, which would need phantom power. So here we go, kick, snare, I'm going to chuck a gate and a compressor and an EQ on, but I'm not going to do anything. And my low cut, I could go a little higher, maybe up to say 100 Hertz, because it's a pretty low tuned snare that's got anything meaningful below there. Hat, definitely some low cut to keep all the spill out, probably up as high as it'll go. 400 Hertz, maybe I'll go back to 300, but just see, depends on the miking. 300, I'm probably not going to do too much else to it. I might do a little bit of EQ, but I can sort that out at the time. Toms, pretty common to gate them. So I just go through, and one of the things you can do is go hover your mouse over the button and just click right. And then I've got a deactivated gate on everything. I wouldn't gate the overheads because it'll cut off the tails of the cymbals. I might want an EQ on the toms. And I might want a compressor on the toms. Overheads, probably a low cut. I would usually go all the way up on the overheads because we're getting the bottom end and everything else, and it's just a way of eliminating low frequency phase from the distance mics. But if they start to sound weird and thin, this is also a thing I'd do. Low cut on my tom, maybe down to, depending on where they're tuned, you're pretty safe down to around 80 Hertz. Floor toms, you might want to go a little lower. So just go sort of 80-ish on each one, just to leave that space for the important things like the kick drum, especially the high toms. Once we get down to the floor tom, we might go down to sort of 60-ish. Let's just go 60 there just to see. Floor toms tend to not be used a lot, especially if you've got double floor toms, so right around the bottom. There we go. So now I've got, if we scroll through, we've got a kick, snare, hat on the left hand side, drummers right, drummers left, and then we go through the toms. Oops, I missed one of the low cuts on the toms. See, it pays off to just check all these things. Getting a little lower there, overheads, bass, DI, probably going to want a compressor, probably going to want an EQ, probably want a low cut, but not by very much. Don't usually have a gate on the bass just because it cuts off the tails. Similar things on here, bit of a low cut, 35 hertz or so. And of course, if the bass sounds a bit thin, fix it up. There we go. Guitars, depending on the tuning, in this particular band, they're tuned a little lower, but still, there's not much below 80 that you need. It's just going to get in the way of the bass guitar. Vocals, similar thing. The human voice, there's not much below 100 hertz. That's actually useful in that. And you could go through and do a bit of proximity tuning as well. The effects, in this particular case, I'm going to roll all the way up because it's a crystal mic and it doesn't have anything below 500 hertz anyway. So just in case rumble and bits and pieces are getting through. Sampler, because there's some low frequency samples in there, I'm going to treat it a bit like a kick or a snare and just use the low cut to protect the bottom end because it doesn't need it. Most of it's mid-range for intelligibility, but just a protection high pass filter. I won't go in and guess what the EQ is going to need in the room, but this just saves me a little bit of time. Probably don't need to, maybe I'll put a compressor on the sampler, just keep it down. I wouldn't use a gate on anything like this. You might be tempted to use a gate on the vocals, but it's going to cut off the ends of the words, soft words and things like that. Cool. So from there, that's a pretty good setup. If I can go back to all my channels, go through, check my DCAs are done, got my effects. You could name your effects. You could actually go onto your buses and say, instead of mix bus 1, I could call that the drum fill, because that's going to be feeding the drum fill. The other monitors behind the drummer. So I could call that drum fill. I could call that monitor 2, which is going to be the vocals on stage or the vocal mic. And there was some information on here, some details about monitors, like what the artists want. So these are good things to know. So a lot of this information is about the backline supply and things that we would require, and then an indication of what we want in the monitors, just in case we don't get a chance to talk. Might be under the pump, getting ready, because we're opening for an international band and they don't give us much time for sound check. The doors are about to open. So if we can just be on stage without having to communicate with the engineer, and they know that we want just the kick, sampler, guitar and bass and the drum fill, and the kick, snare, guitar and bass, medium, and samples and lead vocals low, unusual for a singer, but you can have that in place. Just saves a little bit of time if you're clear. So the more information you can put on there, the better. So that's the tech writer, and here is my finished show file, at least my starting one for sound check. So I'm going to save that now, and remember I said save it on this right hand channel. I want to select everything and save as scene, and I'm going to call this, and that will save it as a .scene file. Have a go. I'm sure you'll be able to figure it out, and there's plenty of resources on the internet so you can go further and further. But you load that up on the desk and it will work. Ka kite.